The reason we wanted to meet early today is because we have folks from Harvard joining us, so it's a bit late there in Massachusetts. They are going to be showing you a tool that I think they have trained other journalists on, but probably no one in your newsrooms, and I think that it will be a really wonderful thing for you all to learn and hopefully use moving forward. So joining us today, we have Annie White. Annie is the Director of Software Tools at the Harvard Growth Lab, where she is in charge of the tool that you will be seeing today, the International Atlas of Economic Complexity. And it also has a number of sub-national atlases, so she'll show how to get into specific country information, which hopefully will be very useful to all of you. But prior to joining Harvard, she was at Sustainalytics, where she launched ESG risk and analysis software. And prior to that, she was a policy analyst with the International Food Policy Research Institute. Also joining us is Tim Cheston. Tim is the senior manager of applied research at Harvard Growth Lab. Prior to that, he worked for the World Bank on their social protection and then labor project, and has also led research on microfinance and small business financing, specifically focusing on the role of economic diversification and explaining differences in growth between and within countries. So again, Andy and Tim have a lot of expertise here, and I really hope that the demo that they're going to show you and kind of walk through will be useful to you all. So please join me in welcoming Annie and Tim. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne, and good morning to everybody over in the room. It's great to be here today. We're very excited to join you all. As Anne was mentioning, what we really want to use this time for today is to take you through a demo of our flagship tool at the Growth Lab called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. Anne had mentioned that I oversee our software development team at the lab, and this is a little bit of an unusual setup at a research organization in a policy school to have software development in-house. And the reason why we feel so strongly about having those capabilities in-house is because we think that online, accessible, user-friendly web applications are some of the best ways not only to disseminate research coming from the lab, but to make it accessible to all kinds of people, including yourself, to leverage as you see fit. And so the Atlas is our flagship tool. It has had millions of users from around the world. Today, we have users in just about every country worldwide, predominantly policymakers, but also journalists just like yourself. The tool has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Post, and so on. The really important thing to know about the Atlas is it's an amazing distillation of so many of the core concepts that are important to us at the lab and that sort of underpin much of our research. And so before we get to the Atlas itself, I want to turn it over to Tim so we can spend just a few minutes laying that foundation so that you're nice and clear on some of those core concepts, and then we'll jump right into the Atlas and of course save lots of time for your own questions. Tim, over to you.
Excellent. Great to be with you all this beautiful morning and evening here in Boston at Harvard. Excellent. So I will provoke you with all of economic history, and about the goal would be to encapsulate this into 7 minutes, and especially to kind of think through how we can create narratives from some of the hard work that Annie's team does in trying to distill a lot of the concepts from research into really easily digestible, user-friendly, freely accessible tools on the Atlas. So, our research within the Growth Lab at Harvard really focuses on the nature of economic growth and really rethinking the nature of economic growth. And if we have to characterize economic growth, we have to think of it in the long arc of history. And if we have two graphs that depict what we mean by economic growth, well, there hasn't been significant growth for the vast majority, for the long history of humankind, except in the most recent period. And if growth can be characterized by this hockey stick, we also know that if we zoom into the most recent period, growth has not been uniform, but highly divergent. So when we think of this question of economic growth, I want to plant with you today a question of why is it that we live in a world in which this is likely the same industry as this industry, and yet operates with completely different levels of technology, completely different levels of productivity to operate within the same sphere. You know, we often dedicate museums to things that to old technologies or old periods of history. And our question today is why we can live in a world in which technology has not uniformly spread across all societies, that describes the vast differences in incomes that depicts the economic picture of the world today. And so economists rarely agree on anything, and actually there is some greater consensus that we cannot describe the differences in productivity between this same industry by greater population sizes within country, greater capital investment within countries. It all comes down to what we call in the production function technology. And technology is this brilliant word that everybody likes to agree with and sign off on communiques about that technology is the key to growth. But technology is also not well defined as a concept itself. And so today I want to leave with you kind of the three main areas of how we define technology. One is codified knowledge, such as this drone, this is embedded knowledge, such as this drone, in which all of the knowledge of how to assemble and produce this drone is captured within the drone itself. And I can fly this drone without having to know how to produce the drone. It's embedded in the tool itself. And the second form that we think of is blueprints or codified knowledge. And codified knowledge is a how-to manual in which you follow a procedure in order to access the knowledge that is there. And so the question we will leave you with today is to say, if a ship can bring a tool such as a drone to the furthest parts of the world, and if anyone can get access to the internet to follow the how-to manuals of how to fly an airplane, why is it that technology has not uniformly spread? And we think that the answer to that question has to do with the answer to the question, what do you do when your tooth hurts? And so, of course, you have your spouse go on Amazon, buy all the dental tools that you need. You go on Wikipedia, you read the how-to manual, and you have your spouse take care of it. Is that correct? No, we all go to see a dentist. And so again, what does a dentist has? A dentist has the third part of knowledge, what we call know-how or tacit knowledge. And yes, the dentist has the tools and the dentist has learned from codes, but what the dentist has in their brain is this tacit element of knowledge that is learned over long periods of learning by doing, of failure and repetition, in which you perfect a craft. Or as Malcolm Gladwell would say, it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in something. And so this, in modern society, is the reason that your dentist is not also your lawyer. That increasingly, as societies become richer, as societies become more complex, we don't put more know-how into the same brain. We actually specialize and have different bits of knowledge and different brains, such that they come together to produce more complex production. So again, you can think of Rafa Nadal. If you read Rafa's book about how to play tennis, if you use his racket or his embedded knowledge, you will unfortunately not be as good as Rafa tomorrow. He really has the tacit knowledge held in his brain that is the slowest part of technology to transfer from individual to individual, much less society to society. And so we want to unpack the understanding of complex or modern industries to not think of it as one individual to one industry. This is no longer the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker in which one individual composes in a whole industry. We need to think of the airline industry as not being able to operate unless it has all of the flight attendants, the security, the maintenance, the air traffic controllers, in order for that industry to be able to operate. So we want to break down industries to understand the know-how that is required to operate that industry, thinking of it less as individuals and also more as the collective knowledge of a team that is able to operate and do things more than any individual in that team could do by themselves. So again, this is not to judge one person's know-how. This is a community in Ecuador. One family can produce all of the goods here that I would not be able to produce myself, but it happens to be the same set of knowledge that the other farming community households are able to produce. And so they all have the same bit of know-how within that community. We would call this kind of a one letter or a one know-how community, and compare that to an electronics store in which any product you see here cannot be made by one individual or household, much less gets divided into different firms composing even one unit or one camera, as we see in the store here. Or we take one industry such as Boeing that employs different know-how across different countries in the world and combines it to produce one industry of the airplane itself. So again, this is not about size, and this is a chicken factory in which if you replace a worker in the foreground to somebody in the background, you would still have the same level of productivity within the plant because the operations are generally the same. We want to be thinking of economic complexity as an orchestra, in which if you change a trained trombonist to go play violin, you are going to affect the nature and the quality of the music that is being played because the violinist has specialized know-how that cannot simply be replaced with another individual of another specialty. So again, we think of all of economic development as a game of Scrabble. I hope some of you have been able to play this game. We think of each letter in a game of Scrabble as being a different bit of know-how, a different capability set. And we think that countries or even cities combine their letters to produce words or industries. So again, we see that as this kind of agrarian community that has one letter, that everyone in that community has that same letter, you're able to produce one industry. And the kind of simple, what you learn from Scrabble here is that as you add more letters, so now we have 3 letters, we can now make 4 words of up to 3 letters. So now we have the word act that we're able to make. Add another letter, and now we exponentially begin to grow to 9 words of up to 4 letters. And with 10 letters, the Scrabble dictionary says we can produce 595 words and words of up to 10 letters, including words like coaling, coding, much more complex words. So we would say that all of economic development is this process of adding additional capability sets, adding new know-how to be able to produce more diverse production and production that is more complex, that requires more letters, that you can only produce the word coding if you have all of the 7 letters in that word. And if you're missing any of those letters, you're not able to produce that complex industry itself. So again, when we analyze why these two industries can look so different from a technology perspective, we are not saying the farmer on the left knows more than the farmer on the right. If anything, the farmer on the right is very comfortable in air conditioning and just knows how to turn a wheel, doesn't know how to train the oxen to produce the same good. It is not about the know-how within one individual. It happens to be that the society to which the farmer on the right lives is a more specialized society that not only knows how to manage tractors, also has somebody to maintain that tractor, has a market in which that wheat can get to market on time and be rewarded with a higher market price. And so this is not a game of Scrabble. This is a real analogy that we put behind the data. We show that countries grow, again, by this dual concept of increasing the diversity of the production they can produce, but also producing less ubiquitous or less common products that require more letters and all of those letters to be present in order to produce these goods. And we can also put those letters and those words into what we call the product space. And Annie will guide us through this space. And this is a space of technological similarity. And so we can see in the right hand in the green, we see that textiles are often very similar to each other, that countries that know how, so short distances here mean that a country has a high probability of producing both goods. So we see if a country produces men's shirts, it likely also produces women's pants. But over here on the far reaches are some areas of machinery. We have cars here in the middle. So countries that produce textiles are often require a very different sets of technology, very different sets of know-how in order to produce machinery. So few textile producing countries are able to leap into machinery. Here we have electronics in the bottom left, and at the top, at the edge of the world, at the edge of this space, we see oil, which means that the know-how rudely of knowing how to dig a hole in the ground is not shared by many other industries. Very few other industries require the knowledge of oil rigs and oil digging there. And even plastics seems very far away from the know-how of a viable oil industry in the world today. So we can learn a lot of the function of how countries can diversify by examining what capabilities you have and where you sit within this space and comparing that narrative. And I want you to think through how that narrative has evolved both over time. So here we see that Vietnam today has a nearly complete textile industry, but also a very budding electronics industry. And when we compare that over time, we see that the electronics side of that story has not existed historically. But we can also learn a lot from comparing Vietnam today to other emerging economies in the region, like Indonesia looks very different. Some areas of textiles not complete, some fledgling parts of electronics, also some strong export of agriculture in the yellow there as well. And compare that to the nature of, say, an oil economy. It looks very different in terms of the know-how and capabilities that are there today. So with that study of what you know how to produce, how diversified you are, and how complex your production is, we are able to come up with this metric of economic complexity for all countries globally. And but at the end of the day, why is this meaningful? And this is meaningful because our research over the past 15 years has found that the relationship between your complexity, your economic complexity today, and your income per capita today is a kind of economist's dream of an R squared above 0.6. So the R squared is 0.68 here. And we find this to be a very important description that your complexity describes your income per capita today, but it's not just useful as a static measure. It is really valuable because your complexity relative to your GDP today also predicts future growth. And what I mean by that is you can say, great, 0.68 is a great correlation, but we see many countries are far from this line. So we see here that the Philippines is far below the income level we would expect for the complexity of the Philippines. And so you say, Philippines, what are you doing with such a low level of income? And we find that this predicts that the Philippines will be one of the fastest growing economies moving forward because it already has the complexity necessary to be able to absorb and maintain a higher income level. And unfortunately, the analogy also exists in the opposite dimension. You say, Greece, why are you so rich? You do not have the complexity to sustain your society without the complexity necessary to sustain that income. And of course, Greece has been falling significantly, unfortunately, on the income track rather than trying to improve its own economic complexity. And so we can also see and predict countries' future growth using this unique and singular measure of your complexity today. We find to be the strongest predictor of the strongest single indicator that can predict your future growth for the years to come. And we, of course, find that East Asia will likely be a significant growth hub in addition to parts of Eastern Europe and East Africa. But a lot of the growth polls that we see will continue to be driven by East Asia for the decade to come. So with that, I turn it to Annie to show you how you can apply this to your country of interest, not just as a presentation, but a real actionable tool that Annie's team has worked very hard to produce.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tim. I will share my screen so that we can get right to the atlas. I think what Tim's presentation showed more than anything is that at the Growth Lab, we take a capabilities view to economic development, where we say the know-how that exists in your country today will strongly inform the opportunities available for diversification and growth in your country. So it's a very place-based approach. And so in building the atlas, our job is to reflect that dynamic for every single country in the world. So one of the great things about the atlas is that it indeed covers every country in the world and over 6,000 different products and services. I want to start by just letting everyone know this is going to feel like a little bit of a fast demo, but the good news is that the Atlas is a free tool publicly available for anyone who wants to use it. So we encourage you to actually go explore even during the Q&A, and certainly after this presentation. It will likely create more questions than we can cover today. So always feel free to come back to us. We're happy to set up sessions after to dig in even further. Today, I want to show you 3 core ways to access information in the Atlas, and they're all laid out really nicely here at the top of the tool up here in our navigation. So the first way we're going to get into the Atlas is by just clicking on Explore. And what you're going to see first and foremost in the Atlas is that data visualization is front and center in all the tools we build. We think a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's an amazing way to reflect large sets of data. This is an international trade group, I know, and so it's probably very useful for you all to know that our core data set in the Atlas is Comtrade data. Those who are really keen on Comtrade data might realize that our data in the Atlas is ever so slightly different than Comtrade raw data. And that's because before we upload data into the Atlas, we undergo a really rigorous data cleaning methodology inside the Atlas. A number of our analysts and fellows work on this, and that's just to ensure that where there are some reporting discrepancies or lack of reporting in general, we can kind of make up for those differences through inferencing. Okay, so this is largely driven by Comtrade data. When you get to the Atlas, one of the first things to sort of orient yourself around in the Explore section is this idea that you can start your journey with either picking a location or a product. So we're going to start with location today. That's usually the most popular way to start. And so I can pick a country like Vietnam. And right away, what I start to get a sense of are those capabilities in the country of Vietnam. Well, how do you measure capability in a country? We had to figure out what a proxy is for that. And we decided that export imports are a good proxy for what you can do in your country. If you're building it and exporting it, that's a pretty good measure of the skill set or the know-how that exists in your country. So here we have a picture of Vietnam's exports or its export basket in the year 2020. The exporter is Vietnam, importer is all countries and all products. You might come down here and say, well, everyone knows that about half of Vietnam's exports, I think just under half, are electronics. Tell me something about their export basket without those electronics. And so I can come in here and perhaps hide a sector or bring it back. I might say electronics are the only thing I care about in Vietnam's exports, and I can isolate those. So we try to give the user lots of opportunity in the Atlas to customize, or as we say up here, build your visualization, okay? I might come in here and say, okay, this is 4-digit Comtrade data. I don't need anything that disaggregated. I just need the 1-digit. And here you get this super nice kind of aggregated bird's eye view of the export basket. Or you might be a person who really cares about that 6-digit data. And we break it all the way down for you here as well. Timelines are super important in the Atlas. Not only do people want a snapshot of an export basket, but you want to be able to go back in time as well. So I'll bring us back to 4-digit data. And as you can see down here at the bottom of the visualization, we have a timeline going back all the way to 1995 if you're in the HS categorization, or you can switch this to SITC and you can go all the way back to 1962. Okay, so what's super interesting, of course, in the case of Vietnam is that here's that very, very small electronic sector back in 1995 worth about $31 million of its exports. And if we come back all the way to 2020, we really see electronics grow, of course, to 133 billion. Okay. So that's looking at the exports of Vietnam. I might come in here and say it's not exports at all that I care about. It's actually imports. I have to add back my my electronics. There we go. And so here are Vietnam's imports. Okay, so we can always toggle back and forth between exports and imports. What this is showing us are all of Vietnam's exports in 2020. But I might come in here and say, I actually am very interested in a specific product. I mentioned that the Atlas has over 6,000 products and services, which you can search here. So we've nested them all really nicely in this drop-down menu, if that's how you like to explore. I have a funny feeling that in this group, there are people who know the product trade codes. So you can always come in here and search by product code. And you can, of course, come in here and search by name as well. And here you can see that when I look for Vietnam's exports by product, in this case, telephones, I now see its trading partners. Okay. I might come in here and say, I want to know what Vietnam is doing with its partners. So I can come in here, and again, we cover every country in the world, aggregated up into regions. And so we might want to look at the relationship, the trade relationship between Vietnam and China. And here we see that product breakdown. Okay, so what I want to demonstrate here is really the choose your own adventure nature of the explore section of the Atlas. So many permutations, whether you're looking at this from data classification, digit levels, time, partner, product, and so on. Of course, this is not the only data visualization in the Explore section. So I was talking about how time series is very important in the Atlas because we want to see what changes over time. The tree map can do that for you, but it's a snapshot of each individual year. You can also come to this stack graph and see that data over time. We'll come back to product really quickly. And of course, we see this really amazing evolution of Vietnam's exports over time, where there's sort of this long tail of growth and then it skyrockets. And once again, you can always come in here and really customize what you're looking at. Perhaps 4-digit is a little bit more of a breakdown for us, or 1-digit. Another really interesting overtime visualization in the Atlas is market share. So here we're showing Vietnam's global market share per sector over time as well. And of course, for every country, this is always a very, very interesting visualization because we often see surges and drops. And so here we have Vietnam's market share in textiles in green, skyrocketing. And then, of course, here are those electronics once again. We can get rid of textiles and we can get rid of electronics. And we see this graph adapt to get a little bit more insight as to what's going on in the bottom. And so we can see here that stone, for example, stone exports has surged in the last few years, but services has dropped. Okay, so that's sort of an interesting analytical story happening there. And then, of course, we can add them back. So in the Atlas and Explore, we provide 4 data visualizations to really get a sense of a country's imports and exports, sort of as a proxy for what's going on in this country in terms of capability and know-how. That sets us up to start to understand the complexity in the country and opportunity available to this country in terms of growth and diversification. So in Tim's presentation, he mentioned the product space. The product space is a really amazing data visualization designed at the Growth Lab. And it sort of takes on this quirky shape no matter what country you're looking at. So the shape stays the same no matter what. But the product space is a really amazing bird's eye view of what an economy is doing today. But it also tells us something else. It tells us because you're doing something today, very specific opportunities exist nearby. And so the product space is telling us those 2 things. Where is Vietnam in the product space, or where is your country in the product space? And how does that set you up for new opportunities? So again, we're looking at Vietnam here in the product space in the year 2020. And we can see that there's lots of activity happening here where it's green. So I should stop and just point out, every circle you see here is a product. It's a 4-digit product, in fact. So there's about 800 4-digit products in the product space. And distance, or the position of every one of these circles, matters, because we're saying if 2 nodes or circles exist side by side, they require the same sorts of inputs or know-how to produce. So it's not surprising then that we would see a huge clustering in this green section of the product space. I can zoom in a little bit here, because this is all textile manufacturing. Okay, so the know-how it requires to produce leather footwear is very, very similar to other garments, for example, or men's shirts. And that's why they're side by side. And this is a very active sort of space for Vietnam. But what's also interesting is that there's lots of activity happening here over on the other side of the product space, where we see, of course, electronics. We saw that in their tree map. We see it represented here. And so what we know is that, for example, because electronic integrated circuits, for example, is closely related to the production of computers, computers represents perhaps an opportunity for Vietnam's further diversification and opportunity for growth. So if a node is colored, if it has one of these bright sector-related colors, we say that it has an RCA, or a revealed comparative advantage, above 1. And what that means is that the country is sort of doing its fair share of that production in that country. If the node or the circle is not colored, it doesn't mean nothing is happening in that country. It just means it doesn't sort of have that outsized share of production yet in the country. And so it potentially represents an opportunity if it shares kind of the same know-how of what's already happening. Okay, excuse me. One really cool feature of the product space is that you can once again go back in time. And you can see how the product space evolves over time for countries. You can hit this play button here, and you can see it's a little bit slow, so we won't wait for the whole timeline to move through this time. But you can see even in the 90s, there was not much happening over here in electronics. But over time, you can start to see this section lighting up. We'll fast forward a little bit here to 2010, and you can see more activity picking up in that section over there. So the overtime evolution of the product space is a very, very interesting dynamic. Just for purposes of contrast, I'll switch countries very quickly to, for example, the United States. If I look at the United States in the product space, you're going to see a very different set of nodes light up. And that represents the United States economy in the product space. And so obviously, just by quick glance, you can see there's not a whole lot of textile manufacturing happening in the United States like there is in Vietnam. But if we zoom in here to the center of the product space, we can see lots happening around vehicle manufacturing. And that sets the United States up for a completely different set of related growth opportunities than, for example, in Vietnam. The United States also has a lot happening up here in chemicals, biotech, medicine, and so on. So every country you look at in the product space will have the same layout, but the nodes that light up will be completely different depending on the exports of that country. Okay. I'm going to wrap up this section really quickly by saying one of the important conclusions of this Explore section is, well, okay, depending on what I'm currently doing in my country, what opportunities exist for me now? And I mentioned, I'm actually going to switch us back to Vietnam. I mentioned how you can get a sense of this in the product space, but we also sort of plotted them a little bit differently in this scatter plot. To say that, let me just zoom out ever so slightly here. So here, a circle once again is a product, just like it is in the product space, only this time, if the circle is colored, it represents a product where the country may not necessarily have that sort of outsized representation yet, or a high RCA. And so we measure those feasible products along 2 dimensions. So how close it is to things that we already know how to do in the country, and how complex is it? And so ideally, you would want to focus your attention on opportunities that are low distance. So they're very close to what I already know how to do in my country, and they're high complexity. Okay, so they sort of lend to that nice, diverse economic ecosystem. And so in the case of Vietnam, indeed, that could be computers, for example. And we saw that in the product space, that computers is actually very close to other things the country already knows how to produce. Okay, so in the Explore section, it really is a choose your own adventure. It's non-linear, and we sort of try to take you from choosing a country all the way down from understanding its export and import baskets to understanding what opportunities are therefore available for the country's growth prospects. Okay, really quickly, you can also come in here and see this whole workflow, but from the product side. So you might say, it's not even a location I really care about. I really want to understand the dynamics of a product. And so I can come in here, we'll choose telephones once again. And as a product, I can explore the export market and the import markets for a particular product. Okay. I'm going to quickly move ahead. Because there's another, I said that there were 3 core ways to access the Atlas from an analytical perspective. So this was Explore, building your visualization. And as I showed you, building your visualization is non-linear. You can jump all over the place and customize this in a million different ways. But what we heard from people is what a lot of users wanted was really that story of how my country evolved and what opportunities are available for my country. People wanted more of sort of a beginning, middle, and an end of that evolution. And so we built something called country profiles. Country profiles are a little bit more of a narrative approach to this story of economic growth. I'm going to choose Vietnam once again, since we already started there. Country profiles begins by just giving us a little bit of a summary of the country. And so we say, okay, it's GDP per capita, it's economic complexity index ranking. So Vietnam is ranked 52nd out of 133 countries in terms of its complexity. And then we do growth projections every year at the Growth Lab. For those who are sort of eagerly awaiting, our update to growth projections is scheduled to come out in the next week. So this will be updated quite soon. I won't go through every single page in country profiles. It's going to take us too long, but we start in a very familiar way here. We start by describing a country's export basket because that sort of tees off the story. What do I know how to do in my country? We tell you something about the complexity of your exports. We want to see an export basket that is diverse and rich in complexity. And so we measure that here in country profiles. We want to try to understand which of your exports are driving your growth. So a good news story is that your highest growth is coming from your high complexity products. And we can see this trend develop over a 3-year range all the way up to a 10-year range. So what's driving growth in a country? I talked about global market share in Atlas Explore. You'll see that here again. Another very important dynamic we like to see in countries is of your export basket, how much of that is new products? In the case of Vietnam, it's a huge proportion. So here's a little legend up here at the top. We're showing 2020 export basket. That's what you're seeing in the previous tree map. And 39% of that export basket are new products added in the last 15 years. Okay, so that's a huge proportion. Over here, you'll always see a little comparison table that we provide for countries with 4 sort of regional peers. And you can see benched against some of its peers, Thailand, China, South Korea, 44 new products in the last 15 years is a massive proportion. Okay. We go on to show a country in its product space. This is very important for understanding diversification opportunities. What am I doing now and what is that connected to? So we show Vietnam in the product space. And then we start in country profiles to actually recommend a policy approach. So by no means is this a tool to build a policy for you, but we can tell something about a country's exports, its potential, and its growth, and what kind of policy approach it might take vis-a-vis other countries. In the case of Vietnam, we say because of Vietnam's complexity vis-a-vis its income, and because of its connectedness to new products, that's here over here on the y-axis, it should take a light touch approach to policymaking. So it has ample space to diversify calls for leveraging existing success to enter more complex production. In other words, it has lots of opportunity around what it already knows how to do. There's the opposite approach where we say a country might have very few nearby opportunities. If we were to look at it in the product space, there aren't a lot of colored nodes. And so it has to make bets, strategic bets, to account for its diversification. Okay. And then we take this and we say, sort of like the feasibility scatter plot I showed you in the Explore section, we build that here, but with a little bit more functionality to say that as a policymaker, you might decide in my light touch approach to policymaking, I might take long jumps. I might be feeling a little risky or not so much. Okay. And this sort of serves up a set of products that kind of depend on a different product selection criteria. And finally, just to conclude, we deliver those that set of products in a nice table with all kinds of variables that can be sorted. So you might come in here and say, as a policymaker, right, this is the set of 50 products most feasible to me for growth and diversification. And I want to sort those by global growth over 5 years, the ones that are closest or nearest to what I already know how to do, perhaps the ones that are most complex versus least complex. Okay, and then we summarize it all. So that's country profiles. The last thing I'm going to show you very quickly are complexity rankings. Tim touched on this a little bit in his presentation, where he said that one of the most important things we measure at the lab is how complex is your export basket, and particularly, is it changing over time? And so here we have our ECI index, or our complexity ranking over time. Again, I can search for a country. We'll choose Vietnam once again, and we can see, and we saw this a little bit in that overtime development of Vietnam's export basket, that indeed its complexity has risen over time from a ranking of 93 all the way up to 52 today. Okay, and we present this in various ways. So you might say, I want to compare Vietnam to other countries. So here's that trajectory once again for Vietnam, and you can see it compared to India, for example, Ethiopia. We can add another country here. We might want to compare Vietnam to the Philippines, and here it is. So the Philippines indeed ranks a little bit higher in terms of complexity vis-a-vis Vietnam, slightly lower than China. But a very similar trajectory overall. And then finally, for those of you who like tables, plain and simple, we serve up the ECI index as a table down here, which can be sorted either by year or filtered by year and sorted by rank. Okay, so in our ranking, Japan is at the top as the most complex country in our ranking, followed by Switzerland and Germany, all the way down to the bottom where we see some of these smaller economies, Angola, Liberia, and so on. Okay, so that's a lot of information to cover in a short period of time. I'm going to stop because I'm mindful of time and I'd like to get in as many questions as possible. I'll continue sharing my screen in case some of your questions take us in a certain direction, but I'll pass it over to our moderators for any questions in the room.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much. And I do want to get to questions as quickly as possible, but I also want to make sure that the journalists see on this page the data download, image download, and share aspects, so they know how they can incorporate whatever data visualization they build, how they can put it into their stories.
Exactly. So just down here in the Explore section, data download will download, of course, the Comtrade data that builds this visualization. Whatever settings you apply here, it'll be reflected in your data download, and then image download as well gives you options for downloading the image.
And then share, would that allow for embedding and sharing on social?
Exactly.
Just
Yep.
social. Great.
Yep.
So I know that you all come from different size newsrooms. So some of you, Wall Street Journal, you would probably want to make your own visualization in your style. But for those of you who come from newsrooms that don't have a lot of graphics editors, those are really useful for you all, because basically you can put in what you need and get it right there. So, okay, let's start with Angi.
Hi, Annie. My name is Anggi from the conversation. My questions are very simple actually, but I think it's important to know if I want to, let's say, use this matrix in my writing. So, how up to date the data is? Is this real time, and where do you get the data? Where are the sources from? Because even from my government, I don't think it's we can get the data this complex actually. And also about the feasibility option, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned about it earlier. How do you calculate that? Is it based from the investment port in that sector, or the growth based on the timeline you have presented, like from 90? I can see it clearly, something, 95 from the development or anything. I know this is very simple, but I think it's worth mentioning so our readers, believe its credibility. Thank you very much.
Sure. So I'll answer your first two questions, and then I might hand it over to Tim for the last one. So our data is from Comtrade. So UN Comtrade collects public or country reported trade data continually throughout the year. And we take that data on a semi-annual basis and put it through a cleaning process at the lab. So I think that's the first thing to clarify, is it's UN Comtrade data, and countries report to UN Comtrade their customs data. And so that reporting process is sort of completely independent from us, but Comtrade makes that data available as a resource. We put it through a cleaning process here. That's why it looks ever so slightly different than Comtrade raw data. You asked if our data is real time. It most certainly is not. I wish we had a team big enough to ingest, clean, and develop visualizations for real-time data, but we don't. You can always see the year for the data up here. Right now it's 2020. Within the next 3 to 5 days, we're actually releasing the 2021 update. Some of you might be asking, why in 2023 are you introducing a 2021 update? Part of the challenge with covering every single country in the world is that we have to wait for the vast majority of them to release that customs reporting. And so that takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months. It was much slower during COVID. And so if it's often the case that around that sort of 16 to 18 month mark, we have sufficient volume of data to produce sort of this bilateral trade relationship for every country in the world. So yeah, we hope to release the 2021 update very soon. You asked about feasible opportunities and how that's calculated. Tim, maybe I'll hand that over to you if you want to touch on that very quickly.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's the perfect question. And so here, when we looked at the product space for Vietnam, we saw that computers seemed nearby, but that there were other electronics there as well, versus machinery seemed a little bit further away. And so the question becomes, how do you make that trade-off of which of those, how do you trade off a little bit further from what you currently know how to do versus the kind of what is the complexity or the reward? We think here complexity is a little bit the income per capita that is afforded by that industry. So again, as you increase your complexity, you're also likely to increase your income per capita. And so what is, the product space does not say what the reward is of moving into different industries. So this is a visualization that tries to kind of balance these different values that you might have. And so your goal might be to minimize your risk or go to something that is very nearby. But of course, the things that are very close to what you currently know how to do often are some of the least complex products that are there. So you're going to have to make some, trade-offs here of how far is it from what you currently know how to do, which is essentially how many more letters are you going to have to add? And then also kind of what is the reward that you have, which is the y-axis here, or what additional complexity would this new sector add there? So we try to combine some of the lessons from the product space into some of the reward mechanisms of how attractive a sector is to move into moving forward.
I have a question about the relationship between complexity and predicted growth. Could you explain a little more about how there are countries that are high in complexity, but then income falls instead of increase? So does that mean the relationship is not necessarily positive, or does it take into account other factors like population and things like that? Thank you.
Great, a fantastic question. And so the lesson that we have, in comparing the Philippines, so that line is the kind of average predicted line in the trade-off between economic complexity and your income today. And the discussion of the predictiveness is to say that line is not fully, a correlation of one. It has different countries above and below that line. So for countries that are below that line, we find that those countries are more complex than predicted for their income today. This historically has been where China has been extremely, the residual of the distance from the line has been highest for China over the past 3 decades, in which China has had a much more complex ecosystem than has been predicted by its current income per capita. And we have found that is predictive that China would be amongst the fastest growing countries for the past 3 decades. And actually our, as Andy mentioned, our press release that's coming out in the next 2 days finds that we think that China will be the fastest income per capita growing country for the decade to come as well, based simply not on the actions it takes over the next decade, but the gains it has made historically vis-a-vis its income level. So of course, China has gotten closer to that line because it has realized the income gains, as we would interpret from its higher complexity than expected. But there also are countries that are above that line. So countries that are richer than expected for their complexity level. And we find that those countries have a harder time sustaining economic growth because they do not have the complexity, they do not have the letters necessary to sustain their income levels today. It is not as easy for those countries to diversify based on what they currently know how to do. So on that side, we saw Greece. On that side, we also saw some of the resource-rich countries. There's a few kind of misnomers like Australia, which seems like it is exporting a lot of, the goods exports that Australia has are very commodity driven, that should not result in the income per capita that is afforded in Australia today. What we can't capture as well is that Australia has a very leading service sector in some of the most complex, not just universities, but many other services that are there. But as Annie was saying, this data is required to pass through UN Comtrade, and unfortunately, goods pass through ports, both on the exporting and importing side, in which we can validate that trade data, but we cannot have the microscope we take to the goods trade on the services side because we don't have the equivalent set of ports to monitor your service trade itself. So there are some known examples in which many advanced economies have a more advanced service sector than shown in the data itself. But we do find from this research that it is very predictive in comparing how your economic complexity today compares to your GDP level. And if you're more complex than expected for your income level, we find it predicts fast growth moving forward. And if you're less complex than predicted for your income level, we do find that countries grow more slowly than the average global country moving forward.
And just very quickly, the piece on growth projections that you have, the research coming out in a couple of days, will you also have rankings with that? So like theoretically, you could say, Vietnam ranked 7th in the world on X, Y, or Z, or on economic growth projections, something like that. Will it
Yes.
rank?
Exactly. So when we do the big annual update of the Atlas, not only we update all of the trade data, but we also update our rankings as well. So this page will have, instead of this timeline ending, for example, at 2020, it'll go up to 2021. So we'll expect some of these country rankings to change. And then, of course, here as well, we'll add another year. And so we'll expect a little bit of movement here as well.
Thanks.
And do you want to go over to the growth projections under countries?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Matt, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Matt Haldane with the South China Morning Post. I was just wondering, so bearing in mind that you said this is not a tool for crafting legislation or policy, I'm wondering though, does the product space, can the product space map tell you anything about infant industries and which might hold the most potential for protecting or policy-based approach for developing infant industries?
Yeah, fantastic question. Yeah, and you perfectly stated it, that we would not recommend making legislative decisions simply based on the kind of the product space as it's shown here, without doing further study. And so we think of this kind of not as the end, the product space not as the end result of the basis of legislation, but the perfect starting point from which to explore some of those infant industry conversations. So that's where we often have kind of deeper applied engagements that work with policymakers to kind of craft the lessons of these curated country profiles into kind of actionable steps. And so this is a very actionable tool, but we don't recommend kind of narrowly picking winners and saying, oh, the Harvard tool says here are the 50 industries that Vietnam should move into, and it has to be these 50 industries. We look at this more of saying, it looks like there's this kind of budding, electronics has been successful in Vietnam, but there still remain other new areas of electronics that Vietnam has not moved into. Or you can say that the traditional pattern of structural transformation in large parts of East and Southeast Asia has seen textiles take off first. You see electronics come about 5 years to a decade later, and then machinery is the next sector to come in. And so if Vietnam is to kind of follow that more traditional pattern, and we saw the beginnings of the takeoff here of the machinery sector in the kind of medium blue there at the bottom, what parts of machinery have already begun to take off in Vietnam? How can the government go and study who are those movers? Is it in one part of Vietnam or a different part than where electronics have taken off? And what is necessary to kind of, if machinery is to be the next sector, both what industries hold the biggest promise to make the jump into machinery, and kind of where's the large players within those specific industries would be the next step that we would recommend. So this has the potential of saying not just studying existing sectors, it has the potential to predict that if we think machinery is next, what is the most proximate areas that Vietnam can move into? And then you can study those sectors from a product perspective that Annie showed in saying, which countries are currently have the know-how within that sector, and how do you think of both either attracting the investors into that space or some of the know-how of the experienced personnel to bring them to Vietnam to take off in that machinery sector itself. So we do think that this is a very policy-driven, actionable step, but we also want to avoid some of the pitfalls of industrial policy over the past 30 years, in which governments take a very narrow lens to pick winners from a table that you might see in parts of the site, just to convey that we don't think that that is intended to be the end result, but the beginning of the exploration of how to move into some of these spaces.
We actually have a field trip to Singapore's port right after this, so I think Munira's question will need to be the last. But may we put the fellows in touch with you if they have further questions?
Definitely. Our contact information is on the Atlas in a number of different places. You can go to contact us, or you can go to the About page. You'll find us there. And I can tell you that email address goes right to me. So I'd be happy to be in touch after this.
And as you perfectly mentioned, we've worked very successfully with different media teams. If you need to customize some of these visuals for your own color schemes, or to kind of interpret or to kind of ensure that you're interpreting the data in the right direction. We are here for all kinds of media requests and have had good success across the board, across all different sizes of newsrooms as well.
Thank you very much. Munira?
Okay, this is Monira from Bangladesh. You partly touched the question I'm going to ask. I quickly searched my country in the chart that whether I get the latest data. It's all about 2020. The country itself provide you data, or you ask for data or collect from public domain? Why not the latest data? Because I get my data up to 2022 and half of 2023. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. We hear that a lot from countries who say, we have our 2023 data. Why can't you put it in the atlas? And one characteristic of the atlas, so as I was mentioning, all the data comes from UN Comtrade. We never take independent data sources from the country governments themselves or independent government agencies. Part of the reason for that is because we need consistency in reporting. So we need countries to report NHS. We need one digit all the way down to 6 digit. We need SITC and HS, for example. But we also need to ensure that all the data speaks nicely to each other, because this is a tool with bilateral trade. So if one country is saying they trade in product XYZ, we have to match that to the import XYZ. And so that process of matching or mirroring becomes much more simple if the data set is contained to one source. So the trade-off of that means that we wait for this single source of reporting, and it takes a long time. But it does mean that there's consistency in the reporting, and that's an important part of the reliability.
Exactly. I think it goes to the nature of us as a research team, is that we want to make sure the validity of what we are both showing across all countries, but also in this predictive space of not just telling you what you do today in descriptive trade data, but actually being this kind of unit for both predictive trade data and trying to understand what your economy can be tomorrow is kind of our unique focus from a research perspective itself. I also want to tease that I hope we might be able to engage with you all in the future and be invited back, because Annie's team has been hard at work in moving from this concept of a country as a uniform economic unit to moving towards cities, which requires a very different data set and is highlighted by what we call the Metroverse tool itself. So it's many similar concepts to what we described today, but also kind of can take on a lot of media markets focused more on kind of the economic engines that many cities present in different countries around the world. And thinking of your letters not as if they're evenly distributed across a country, but studying what cities do. Cities often have different specialized focuses within countries themselves. And so we have a new tool that really is beginning to explore the nature of cities and city growth in different parts of the world.
Exactly. So this tool is called Metroverse. It contains many of the same themes, concepts, and methodologies of the Atlas, only applied at the city level. So in the Atlas, where we were looking at Vietnam, here in Metroverse, we can apply some of that complexity thinking to about 6 different cities in Vietnam. So this is a tool that covers, I wish we could say it covers every city, just like we can say the Atlas covers every country, but Metroverse covers about 1,000 cities all over the world. And that's free to use as well. I'm happy to share that link. Maybe I'll put it in chat and then it can be shared with the group at a later time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would be happy to. Thank you both so much. This was very interesting. And I'm sure that a number of fellows will be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy your tour. A pleasure to be with you.